Former Prime Minister Gordon Brown was a new Labour leader of the country between 2007 and 2010. Back then, he was considered moody, sometimes angry. I went to Scotland to meet him and find out how he sees the world now. Gordon Brown, thanks so much for spending some time with us today. We're here to talk about your book, 7 Ways to Change the World. But before we get on to that and globalisation and some of the challenges, climate and so on, I did want to talk to you about things closer to home, things affecting people around your home in Fife and in Scotland's Central Belt, evidence of the cost of living crisis. Can you describe to me what you're seeing at the moment?
We've now not only got food banks, we've got clothes banks, we've got bedding banks, we've got baby banks, we've got fuel banks. We're now in a situation where charity is replacing the welfare state as the last line of defence, the last protection for people in greatest need. And we're about to go into a winter when things are going to get interminably worse. And already the charities that I'm working with locally are preparing for that winter by stocking up blankets, stocking up duvets, stocking up even sleeping bags, hot water bottles, because people are deciding that they can't heat their homes, but they have to find a way to heat themselves. So I don't think the government understands the scale of the desolation and the desperation in communities that they really don't visit. And I think it's up to us to point out that unless you have a plan for this winter and probably to take us through this cost of living crisis, then millions of people are going to suffer when they could be helped. And at the same time, we're not going to get back to the growth that is necessary to deal with the cost of living problems in the first place. So what we need is a plan. We don't know what their pathway is at the moment. They go from 1 month to the other. The whole purpose of making the Bank of England independent was that they would take a long-term view of the future. And so we need a pathway to stable prices.
Sounds like you find it a bit frustrating watching what's going on down in Westminster at the moment.
Well, I think it's pretty clear what needs to be done. The country is being asked to accept austerity because the wage rises that people are being offered are way beyond the rate of, way below the rate of inflation. Public services are diminishing in many respects. There's 7 million or so people on health service waiting lists. And there is no explanation coming from the government. There is no plan. They don't seem to have a clue what to do. Now, we have global events that are impinging on us. The fuel crisis, obviously, globally. We've got, obviously, food crisis globally. We've got debt facing some of the poorest countries on top of COVID, climate change and conflict. And there are things that we can do globally, and we should be taking the lead. But equally, you need a national plan, and you need to explain it. There should be a television broadcast by the Prime Minister explaining what needs to be done. You cannot go through a winter when people are being asked to take the biggest cut in their standards of living for 50 years and not ask people to understand what you're trying to do and give them a plan for what's the way through.
The government are going to lay out a plan, I think, before summer recess, though. I think they are. I
don't think it will be the sort of plan I'm talking about from what I hear. You've got to think 2 to 3 years. It's got to be about growth, because the biggest Achilles heel for our economy is not just the cost of living crisis, it's the failure to grow that means that standards of living have not risen for 10 years and our public services cannot improve. And so you need to lay out a long-term plan. Now, it should have been in Actually, it should have been in Boris Johnson's CBI speech last November when he talked about Peppa Pig instead of talking about an industrial strategy, when he lost his notes, when he hadn't actually thought through what the consequences of going through this winter were going to be. It should have been in the budgets that Rishi Sunak have done. I think he's had 3 budgets this year already.
You think he should have a 4th, don't you?
Of course, because there's got to be a plan. You've got to explain to people what's happening. You've got to show how you're going to get back to stable prices. You've got to show also how you're going to help those people in greatest need, the people that I'm very worried about who are going to suffer heavily this winter. But you've also got to show you've got a way through. And that's 1, 2, 3, 4 years where you've got to show people that you've got a plan for growth and a plan for industry. And it's absolutely clear to me that there is no strategy to do this. And the final thing, of course, we've got to do is repair our trading relations. If we cannot repair our relations with Europe and America, and we're at war, if you like, with both of them for different reasons, but all related to...
Why are we at war with America?
We're at war with America over Ireland, because America will not sign a trade treaty with Britain as long as we cannot sort out the issues related to Ireland.
President Biden, I asked him about this explicitly last September, And he did say that he thought the two things were separate, that there was a trade deal and then there was the Good Friday.
But he may think that, but the American Congress will not think that. There's no chance of a trade deal between Britain and America unless we can sort out the problems that arise in Ireland. And of course, there's no chance of getting better trade relationships with Europe unless we can sort these problems out as well. And that's very much part of our future, because if we cannot export to the leading markets in the world and cannot do successfully with these new industries and new technologies, then the cost of living crisis will be with us for years and not just temporarily.
The consequence of a very tight labour market and inflation has been also a return to trade union militancy. Some would say, you might not, but some would say, the government is determined not to compromise on public sector pay. Is that the right stance?
Well, what the government's got to do is get people around the table and explain to them what's happening. And look, if you can get inflation down in the next 2 years from 9% or 11% now to 3, 4 or 2%, then you can present people with a program. You can say to people, here's a package. You're going to benefit later because your wages will rise as long as we can take action now. But there's nothing of this in everything they say. In fact, what the Chancellor is holding out for is the leadership of the Conservative Party by talking about tax cuts all the time.
It seems to me, though, in terms of pay rises in the shorter term, you seem to agree with the Prime Minister. This is what he said to me at Chogham when I asked him about pay rises for public sector workers. He said, what we can't have is a situation in which increases in pay are wiped out by further increases in prices. That's why you've got to be responsible. He's right, isn't he, that wage increases could lead to an inflationary spike. But you wouldn't lift wages to 6, 7, 8% at the moment, would you?
But he's talking about a situation where he's trying to allege that some groups of workers are leapfrogging over other groups of workers, that this is a sort of traditional wage bargaining round where people are trying to get ahead of others all the time. In fact, everybody in the country is facing a cut in their standards of living. And he's got to explain to people how, if he's asking them to accept sacrifice now, what he's going to do for them to benefit later.
So what you might say, you're going to have to take 3% this year, but next year I will try and increase it to X%, or...
Well, I'm not going to get in the business of figures because these are parts of the negotiation.
You actually understand this. You're a former Chancellor. You get this stuff, as well as a former Prime Minister.
I'm saying, if we could get back to growth, and that would be, let's say, 2.5 or 3% growth coming out of this, then that's an extra 50 or 60 billion a year for the economy. That's an extra 20 billion of revenues for the Exchequer to pay for the things that we need to pay for, including helping people who are in difficulty. And what I think is missing is any sense of the long term. You know, this is a Prime Minister who thinks only from scandal to scandal or crisis to crisis, and it's really sad.
You don't hold him in much regard, do you?
I don't want to be personal about.
I know, but
these things.
It's only because you've said a few things about the Peppa Pig and not having a plan.
I was using Peppa Pig as look. He went to the CBI, and people were expecting him to set out a policy for industry for the future. Probably the most favourable audience he could get. If I had been there, I would have been setting out my policy for industry and for growth. And he not only lost his notes and his way, but he definitely lost his way in terms of any direction. And really, since last November, when we've had 3 budgets consequent to that, there has been no strategy and no plan. And it's really important for any country going through these difficulties to explain, these are global factors that we are trying to control, but we're working collectively. Now, it's no good the Chancellor or the Prime Minister saying they're beyond our control. Most of these global forces can be managed by international cooperation. But at home, I think the lack of a plan and the lack of a sense of direction is really what is the beginning of the end for this government.
Yeah, my only observation was you don't seem to think he's a very serious guy. I mean, that's the impression you're leaving me with.
But Beth, you're trying to get me to be personal about it. These are really big issues of policy.
I just think people watching it will
about the future of our country. Now, if you ask me, would I have been organising parties in Downing Street? No, and I didn't. And people ask me why there were no parties in Downing Street. But equally, I don't want to relegate this. This is an issue of policy affecting the standards of living of millions of people across this country, also affecting the health service and our ability to finance it, where I think we could do better, and affecting the general level of public service.
But let's move on to your book and some of the global issues now that you have been thinking quite deeply about, the 7 ways to change the world. In the book, you identify 7 grave dangers that require global solutions. That was in 2021. Now, in the early summer of 22, you've written a new prologue of your book, which boils down to 3 issues: COVID, climate and war. But isn't what is happening now in Ukraine, of those 3 existential issues, isn't it now really that one issue, in that there's an argument that says that we can't deal with anything on the social democratic agenda domestically or internationally until that situation in Ukraine is settled, that it literally just blankets out everything else?
Well, let me say, first of all, after this shopping centre massacre that has been taking place in the last day and the numbers of deaths, clearly a premeditated attack organised by Putin himself to scare the Ukrainian people. There is no argument now against holding him responsible for this, bringing him before a war crimes tribunal, indicting him. And the best way to do that would be to set up a special tribunal now ahead of the International Criminal Court, arraign him for the crime of aggression, which is provable and demonstrable without having to go into a huge amount of evidence about individual cases of war atrocities. And he should be indicted and he should be charged, and even in his absence he should be found guilty, and so should the cabal around him. There is nothing that Putin understands other than strength. There is nothing he understands other than us showing that we are prepared to stand up to him, and that he will exploit every weakness that we show. And I know that from looking at his record and having worked in the time that he was Prime Minister and President and I was Prime Minister. And I think we've got to send out a very clear message that none of these crimes can go with impunity.
So you don't think that there should be a process waiting for... You think that there should be an expedited process to charge him as a war criminal? I
think that the crime of aggression is obviously... No, I think he does care.
But the problem is, Mr. Brown, partly that if you look at how many countries around the world have actually sanctioned Russia, it's 20% of the world. Can you coalesce the world to charge Putin, or the world's divided on this?
So this is what has happened. We've got NATO unity, but we've got global disunity. So 82 countries either abstained or voted with Russia when they were brought before the Human Rights Council for violations of human rights. As you say, about 150 countries are not imposing sanctions. And the reason, I think, goes back to some of the events of the last few years. Why is it that almost the whole of Africa, the whole of Asia, Latin America, Mexico and Brazil included in Latin America, much of the Middle East are refusing to impose sanctions or to take any action against Putin? And it's because they feel, first of all, double standards. I think they feel that we are concerned about Ukraine, but not about civil wars that happen in other countries. But second, that they do not feel that the globalization that has been led by the West is really working in their favor.
Going back to Ukraine, before we move on, the Prime Minister's view is that Ukraine shouldn't be coerced into what he would describe as a bad peace, and he's worried that the economic fallout of this war might compel other countries to now try and force or encourage Ukraine into a peace in which perhaps some of the land is annexed. What's your view of that? Do you agree with Boris Johnson on that?
I agree with him about the importance of making sure that we do everything in our power to protect the sovereignty of Ukraine. What I think, however, is missing here is the greater coordination in policy. Now, there's been a huge amount of coordination in terms of the first round of sanctions. There's been a huge amount of coordination in terms of saying we'll give you this or that military support. I think Boris Johnson perhaps should spend more time trying to bring people together to agree on what the objectives are for the next stage of this enterprise. And of course, we want to support Ukraine. And of course, there is an issue about where you move from a defensive position, that is, you're helping Ukraine defend itself, to what Russia would see as aggression. But these are things that I think we've got to discuss together. And I think there is a danger that America, Britain, Germany, France, Italy all go in different directions over the next year.
Keir Starmer. He is the Labour leader, obviously. The question I want to ask you is, do you think he sealed the deal with the British public in that some of his colleagues, as you will know, have sort of criticised Keir Starmer for being too boring, to quote them? It's kind of a bit true, isn't he? Does he come across as a bit boring, a bit loyally, not a charismatic leader?
But I think
what do you think?
Every criticism that has been visited on Keir Starmer was visited on me, Tony Blair, Jim Callaghan, Harold
People
Wilson.
didn't call Tony Blair boring, did they?
Yeah, but they did say that Labour didn't have an exciting enough agenda at certain points. I mean, you remember in 1997, people said it was too modest and everything else. But all these criticisms are thrown at Labour leaders. And they're mainly thrown, of course, by a Conservative press that's gotten interested in defeating the Labour Party. My advice to Keir Starmer is usually not to take my advice, because it's better that he does his own thing. But my advice to him has always been not to listen to this and to get on with the job that he's set himself. One to prepare the party so that it's seen by the public as a national party that's capable of representing the whole country. Secondly, to develop his policy. And third, to put across his policy to as wide a group of people as possible. And that includes talking to no voters in Scotland, as yes voters as well as no voters in Scotland, and it includes talking to Leave voters as well as Remain voters in England. We've got to find a way of bringing this country together, and I think Keir Starmer is better placed to do that than Boris Johnson.
Do you think the Prime Minister lacks integrity?
Clearly, he has broken the law. Clearly, he has failed to follow the rules. Clearly, he's evaded his own ministerial code. All these things are true, and I think he's admitted that to be the case. The question, I think, that he didn't quite answer at the weekend is whether he's going to change.
Would you have resigned if you were him at this point?
Well, I'll be honest, I could not have imagined myself breaking the law in Downing Street during a crisis like we've had. And therefore, I could not have stayed in office if I thought I'd let people down in that way.
I've got to ask you this. Scottish independence. Do you think that there will be a second referendum in your lifetime or my lifetime?
I wouldn't rule out that, but I would say that Scotland deserves better than what's happening at the moment. I mean, we're in an endless debate about constitutional details that is leading us nowhere. I would like to see, and I would like to put forward, a far more ambitious plan for the future of Scotland, one that solves some of the constitutional difficulties, deals with the economic challenges we face, builds a far better social fabric for this country, and that's really the issue for the people of Scotland. If the issue is posed as change through independence versus no change, and the only alternative is independence, then independence will be something that people will be prepared to consider. But if it's one kind of change for Scotland, staying within Britain, but in a better situation, both in terms of its economic, social and political future, as against independence, then the change that is within Britain will win.
Do you think Keir Starmer will be the next Prime Minister of this country?
Yes, I do.
Do you really?
Yes, I do.
OK. Thank you. Thanks for your time.